Good evening to everyone from India. This is Sukhendu from Interface, an interdisciplinary research and lecture platform of Bankura University. It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce our esteemed guest today, Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky does not need any formal introduction. However, keeping in mind his ever-expanding legacy of thought, I'm tempted to say that Professor Chomsky is a highly influential linguist, a global public intellectual, an activist, a strong proponent of anti-capitalism, a relentless champion of liberal democratic values, and the voices of dissent, and most importantly, a philosopher of emancipation. Out of his almost 162 books and articles, more than 100 are exclusively dedicated to the trajectories of global politics, covering the last 50 years or so. Needless to mention that Professor Chomsky has radicalized the way we think of and perceive our world. Now it's time for the inaugural session. First of all, I would request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Deb Narayan Bandyopadhyay, to inaugurate this event with his brief remark. Sir, I request you to join.
Thank you very much, Sukhendu. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. You are audible. Welcome, sir.
Okay. Thank you so much. And especially thank you because of organizing such a wonderful lecture by Professor Noam Chomsky. Actually, he is a celebrated name in India. Today, we have an eminent scholar with us who strode across the vicissitudes of history. He was born a decade after First World War, saw the Second World War, saw the decline of the British Empire, the rise of the US cosmopolitanism, the rise of structuralism, post-structuralism, the 9/11, and so many other things. So it is really a great opportunity to be able to listen to him. In 1957, the book Syntactic Structure, and later his classic work on language in 1977, reached the Indian universities a little late. But I remember his theory of the generative grammar as a new methodology was being immensely popular. This book on language actually was a conversation between Chomsky and the French linguist, Mitsu Rana. Despite the fact that it used to reach India a little late, nowadays it's not like that. But at that time, in the 70s, in the early 80s, it used to reach a little late. But still, Chomsky already was a great name in the Indian classrooms and also in the circle of the great scholars of India. After another immensely popular reading popular aspect was Professor Chomsky's 1971 debate with Foucault at Eindhoven University, Netherlands. Personally, I acknowledge my great indebtedness to Chomsky for his wonderful remark that he made in his conversation, which was later on published as a book on language in 1977, where he talked about the intelligentsia. I was very, very much inspired by this. The intelligentsia, which is constitutive of the historians, social scientists, the political commentators, the journalists, and so on, who interpret the given social reality. They act as mediators between social facts and the mass of population. But Chomsky makes a very wonderful literary remark, which gave to me also a scope for flexibility, because I belong to the discipline of English language and literature. And therefore, I found that I also can have access to the problematics of sociology. Let me refer to that remark. He said, the task is not very difficult, and the problems that arise do not seem to rise to pose much of an intellectual challenge. With a little industrial application, one can go for that. One must be careful not to give the impression that only intellectuals equipped with special training are capable of such analytic work. It's not just the intelligentsia would often like us to think. They pretend to be engaged in an esoteric enterprise inaccessible to simple people. It was a great remark, at least for me, because I found that it's through this that I can have access to many different branches of social sciences, although I belonged to the discipline of English language and literature. So today we have Noam Chomsky with us. I express my gratitude to Professor Chomsky for accepting our invitation to talk to us. Thank you very much. And with these words, I actually inaugurate this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Deb Narayan Bandyopadhyay, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, for his wonderful remarks on this event. Now I would request our registrar, Professor Subir Kumar Roy, to briefly share his thoughts on this event. Professor Subir Kumar Roy, you are welcome.
Sukhendu, thank you. Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Deb Narayan Bandyopadhyay, our distinguished guest of the day, Professor Noam Chomsky, all my colleagues, the faculty members present over here of the Bankura University as well as the other universities, all the officers, non-teaching staff, and the students. First of all, my heartfelt thanks to the organizers for organizing such a great event, one of the greatest social thinkers of our time. We feel proud to say it, of our time, Professor Noam Chomsky, for inviting him as a speaker of the day. Already Honorable Vice Chancellor said, already explained the illustrious journey of Professor Chomsky. He was a greatest figure in the contemporary linguistic, politics, cognitive psychology, and philosophy. So far my understanding is concerned, while other analytic philosophers, they view language as an external social object, Professor Noam considers it as an internal natural object, part of human beings, as very much endured within the human being, a part of the cognitive faculty. A great political scientist too, beside his philosophic ideas, because his role during the Vietnam War, perfectly his identity extended towards the whole humanity across the globe as a tool of humanitarian perfection. Honorable Vice Chancellor said, already mentioned, his greatest debate with Foucault and his own idea about the postmodernism and how tilted towards the moral justice, which really gave a unique shape to Professor Noam Chomsky. I just want to remember the very word of Robert Bosky, we know, the biographer of Professor Noam Chomsky, who says at the end of the day, so much of Noam Chomsky's work is about power. If power is in the business of teaching us how to be good consumers, if power is in the business of keeping us down, if power is in the business of teaching us how to vote against our own best interest, then what is the opposite? The opposite is, how do you promote creativity? How do you promote people's ability to think for themselves? How to promote people's understanding of their connection to the people around them in ways that are going to benefit themselves and their environment, as opposed to just allow them to have more power. I do personally believe I want to portray Professor Noam Chomsky as a greatest worshipper of the humanity, a person whose struggle always remains live against the imperialism, against the arbitrariness or anarchism. His idea is not confined within any kind of ism. He is an institute within himself. And it's my request to Professor Noam Chomsky, if today, if his authority will highlight the changing world, because a kind of world again where we are finding the spread of hatred among the people, a situation where the possibility of a warlike situation is lurking across the globe, we shall be highly grateful if his authority will highlight in his speech these positions too. With these words, once again, my gratefulness to Professor Noam Chomsky for his consent to be a speaker of the day, and at the same time, my heartfelt thanks to organizer. Thank you. Over to Mr. Sukhendu Das.
Thank you, Professor Roy, for your thoughts on this event. I would also like to request Professor Jayant Kumar Saha, Dean of Bankura University, to share his thoughts on this event briefly. Professor Jayant Kumar Saha.
Thank you, Dr. Das.
Yes.
First of all, very good evening, Professor Noam Chomsky. Namaskar. Respected Honorable Vice Chancellor, Sir, Professor Deb Narayan Bandyopadhyay, Registered Professor Shubhit Kumar Rai, and other dignitaries present here, and my dear students. No doubt, it's a red letter day of our Bankura University of West Bengal, India. It is our great privilege and honor to welcome globally renowned Professor Noam Chomsky to deliver his thoughts on populism and deterred democracy. Professor Noam Chomsky, the cognitive scientist that examines the nature, the task, and the functions of cognition, the philosopher and political activist, has hugely contributed through his research, books, and lectures towards the sustainable development of our society and its members for the last few decades. Being a thought-provoking political activist, he has continuously provided directions in matters of governance and state policies. You all know that Chomsky is best known for his influence on linguistics, specifically the development of transformational grammar. He believed that formal grammar was directly responsible for a person's ability to understand and interpret mere utterances. In the present socioeconomic era, we are facing incredible inequality among the members of the society across the globe in terms of socioeconomic and political power. Now the questions are whether the so-called superpower states are truly democracy in maintaining their dominancy. Are we getting true reflection of public opinion in the geopolitical tension between the superpower states? In his book, Professor Chomsky, the name of the book is Deterring Democracy. It is probably in 1991. Professor Chomsky highlighted such issues, throwing certain challenges to the narratives built by superpower states. And this populism is now becoming a form of political movement, where the question remains that whether democracy in true sense is being enjoyed by common people in this movement or not. I am sure we will be immensely benefited through his lecture today on populism and deterred democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Saha, for your remarks on this event. Now we all are eagerly waiting for Professor Chomsky's insightful talk on populism and deterred democracy. I have one important announcement and humble request. Please keep your video and microphone off. Participants may send their questions in the Zoom chat box, either in English or in Bengali. Now I would request our honorable guest, Professor Noam Chomsky, to deliver his talk. Professor Chomsky, the virtual stage is all yours. We welcome you all. Professor Chomsky, the virtual stage is all yours. You are most welcome.
Professor Chomsky, please unmute yourself.
Professor Chomsky,
please unmute yourself. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you are audible, sir.
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Am I? Yeah, good. Well, just wanted to thank you all for these insightful comments. I wish that I could be with you in person. Unfortunately, circumstances don't permit that, so do the second best. Before turning to the immediate topic, I'd like to step back to some more general concerns that lie in the background of our discussion today, and in fact in the background of every serious issue that we should be discussing. First, I'd like to go back 77 years to August 1945, August 6, 1945, the day which is indelibly etched in my memory, that of others of my age. That was a day on which the human species had demonstrated that its technical intelligence had reached the level where it was capable of destroying everything. Not quite yet. The atom bomb wasn't that powerful, but it was clear that it would soon be coming. And it did in 1953, when the United States and the Soviet Union exploded thermonuclear weapons, which did indeed have the capacity to destroy everything. So on August 6th, one lesson we learned was about human intelligence. It has risen, or from another point of view, declined to the point where it can destroy everything on Earth. There was another question that arose. Did human moral capacity reach the level where it could control this instinct for destruction? My own recollection on August 6, 1945, was that question was answered negatively. I recall very clearly when the announcement was made about the bombing of Hiroshima, there was some light applause, then people went back to their own activities, and it was forgotten. Moral intelligence showed no sign of comprehending first of all, the immediate atrocity that had taken place, but then the import for the future of human species. Well, the years since have left that gap in place between technical capacity to destroy, which of course continues to increase, and moral capacity to destructive features of our nature. The gap remains enormous. If it's not filled, and soon there'll be nothing else to talk about. We will have succeeded in ending the human experiment ingloriously. Well, as you know, shortly after the atomic bombing, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists established the famous doomsday clock. The hands of the clock are set every year, every January, a group of distinguished analysts analyzing the world situation. They set the hands of the clock a certain distance from midnight. Midnight means termination. We have finished. The first setting was 1947, 7 minutes to midnight. 1953, with the explosion of thermonuclear weapons, the hands were moved to 2 minutes to midnight. Since then, they've oscillated. They didn't reach 2 minutes to midnight again until into the Trump presidency. By that time, they were also considering the enormous threat of climate destruction, which was not really understood in 1945, but was in later years. After that last couple of years, the minute hand has moved towards midnight. Finally, last 2 years ago, the analysts abandoned minutes, moved to seconds. The last setting of the doomsday clock last January was 100 seconds to midnight. This coming January, there is good believe that the second hand will move even closer to midnight. We are on the verge of immense catastrophe. There are 3 issues that are identified by the analysts in their explanation. One, of course, is the increasing threat of nuclear weapons, which will mean essentially total destruction between major powers. Second issue is the failure to deal with the immense and growing threat of climate destruction. The third issue they raise is the deterioration of an arena of rational discourse and the decline of democracy. It may sound at first as if that third issue doesn't belong with the first 2, but it does, because the only way of addressing and overcoming these existential crises will be through rational debate in a functioning democratic system. Although if we don't have that, we're lost. Well, all 3 of these issues have specific reference to South Asia with regard to the climate. Unless current trends are reversed, South Asia will simply become unlivable. Already, I don't have to tell you what you know much better than I do, but already temperatures are reaching 50 degrees Celsius in areas where people have no way to survive, living in deep poverty. It's going to increase. Disasters will increase. You can see not long in the future when South Asia will simply become unlivable under current trends, which are not being reversed. As far as nuclear war is concerned, it's an enormous problem for everyone, but India and Pakistan, it's particularly true. They both countries have enormous nuclear weapons capacity. They're constantly on the brink of war. There's a remarkable passage by the great novelist, Indian novelist Arundhati Roy, in which he describes the scene from the Kargil Mountains, high up in the Himalayas, where the glaciers are melting, the environmental crisis that is impending. And as the glaciers melt, they reveal the crazed India-Pakistan conflict on the Kargil Mountains. Helmets, weapons, skeletons, all from a war in which 2 countries are battling at the peak of the heights of geography for no reason, wasting scarce resources, which must be used to address imminent crises. There can be no clearer sign of human madness or incapacity to control the impulses for destruction, the intent of her passage graphically presented. Well, that's true. India and Pakistan will either overcome this conflict, this enormous waste of human resources in a moment when cooperation is necessary to survival. Either they will overcome this or South Asia is doomed. The third issue that the analysts raise, the collapse, decline of democracy and rational discourse, also is very evident in South Asia, with the Modi government in India moving step by step to dismantle Indian secular democracy with all of its flaws. One of the great achievements of the post-war, post-imperial era, now being turned into a Hindu ethnocracy with severe repression, invasion of Kashmir, all of this collapsing before our eyes. Pakistan the same. It's increased in recent months with radical attacks on the overthrown Khan regime, Khan government, human rights violations. The sphere of discussion and debate is declining, along with democratic framework which would foster it. Well, all of this extends far beyond South Asia. General fact about the current world is that the great powers, China, United States, Russia, must cooperate or they will collapse together. The conflict among them is another form of human insanity. We see that dramatically right now before our eyes in Eurasia, Europe and Asia. Take a look at what's happening with the conflict in Ukraine and think a little bit about the background. There is a background. Since the 1940s, there have been several conceptions as to how Europe should find its place in the post-war world. One conception is what's called the Atlanticist conception. Europe should organize within a US-dominated framework based essentially on a military alliance, NATO, and Europe should follow US orders and demands. That's one vision. An alternative vision was proposed most prominently by Charles de Gaulle, renewed recently after the collapse by Mikhail Gorbachev, who proposed in basically Gaullist terms that the West, Europe, and Russia join and cooperate to create a common European home with no military alliances from Lisbon to Vladivostok, separate independent force in world affairs committed to peace, end of militarism, end of conflict, social democracy, moving forward in the entire region. Well, those two visions were in conflict. One of the things that Vladimir Putin achieved by his invasion of Ukraine was to undermine, at least temporarily destroy the Gorbachev vision of a common European home, and to drive Europe deeply into the pocket of the United States. He provided an enormous gift to Washington by driving Europe to adopt the Atlanticist NATO-based region. The invasion was not only criminal aggression, but an act of criminal stupidity, including from the Russian point of view. Anyway, that's happened. Whether it will last, we don't know. There are strong temptations for Europe to refuse to hang on to Washington's coattails, to move towards accommodation, not only with Russia, but with the growing China-based Eurasian Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, investment loans, and so on, now encompassing most of Asia, reaching out to Africa, even Latin America, much to the distress of the United States. For Europe to separate itself from that, from the European point of view, is near insanity. It'll simply mean to further decline of Europe, the real victims of this, and falling into a US-run violent world. You can see what's happening pretty clearly simply by looking at the map of sanctions. Most of the world is not participating. India, for example, the global South doesn't want to have anything to do with it, condemns the invasion, but it's not going to take part in a proxy war between Russia and the United States, as is developing in Ukraine. Official NATO policy right now, US policy accepted by NATO, is explicit and clear. The war in Ukraine must continue until Russia is severely weakened. The fate of Ukrainians is secondary. The fate of the tens of millions of people in the world facing starvation with the Black Sea breadbasket essentially closed, the threat of nuclear war, none of that matters. Have to fight the proxy war severely. For Europe, it's simply a coal for Europe in decline. Europe will surely be tempted to break out of this and to try to move towards a Gorbachev-style vision of a common European home in which Europe will participate in the China-based initiative, will be open towards the other great Asian economies, which it'll be cut off from if it maintains this stand. I mentioned the sanctions map. I'm sure you know very well. Sanctions are against Russia are implemented by Europe and the English-speaking countries. Japan is joining in. It's basically global South is staying out of it, including India. Well, that's part of the world that's developing. We don't know how this will turn out, but these are conflicts and confrontations that are right on the immediate agenda. Well, let me continue by turning specifically to the United States. Very good reason for that. The United States is the most powerful country in world history. No president, nothing comparable. Maybe if it's declining, it's primarily from its internal destruction from within. But it will remain, surely, certainly the greatest military force in the world by a huge margin, and has enormous natural advantages that other countries don't have. So what happens in the United States is going to it's going to affect the world in very powerful ways. It's therefore important to pay close attention to it. And what is unfolding in the United States before classical tragedy? The grim conclusion is foreordained. The march towards it seems inexorable. The origins are deep in the history of a society that is free and bountiful for the privileged, awful for those who were in the way or cast aside. A stage was reached that has considerable similarity to today. Speaking of the 1920s, there's a great American labor historian, David Montgomery, wrote a classic study of that decade. The title of the study is The Fall of the House of Labor. It's writing about the destruction of the labor movement under Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare, most repressive period in U.S. history. Montgomery writes, I'm quoting him, that in the 1920s, corporate mastery of American life seemed secure. Rationalization of business could then proceed with indispensable government support. That's the 1920s. Also today, inequality in the 20s was soaring along with corruption and greed. The vibrant American labor movement had been crushed by Wilson's Red Scare after years of violent repression. The United States had an unusually violent labor history. Well, Montgomery continues to say that modern America had been created over its workers' protests, even though every step in its formation had been influenced decisively by the activities, organizations, and proposals that had sprung from working class life. That's quite true. 19th century, as industrial capitalism was developing, a major labor movement developed along with it. It's called the Knights of Labor. It's quite radical. Its demand was, quote, the main slogan, those who work in the mills should own them. They regarded it as an utter intolerable indignity, an attack on basic human rights for a working person to be subject to a master, what we call having a job. That was considered utterly intolerable, different from slavery, only in that it was temporary. Standard term was wage slavery. That was such a common opinion in 19th century America that it was actually a slogan of the Republican Party. Hard to believe today. But Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party had one of its main planks that wage slavery is intolerable. Maybe it's okay if it's temporary until a person can become free again, but those who work in the mills should own them. Labor movement was vigorous, active, spreading with this kind of very free labor press, very vocal, very extremely interesting to read, included both men and women, what were called factory girls, young women from the farms who were driven into the mills, had their own journals, very lively, full of development of a similar our message. Well, that was labor. At the same time, the United States was, of course, mainly an agricultural country then. Same time, the 19th century, farmers were organizing in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, all through the Midwest, forming farmers' organizations who were seeking what they called a cooperative commonwealth that would free farmers from the tyranny of northeastern bankers and market managers. They would do it themselves. That's the populist movement, genuine populism, not what the term means today. Farmers organizing to develop a cooperative commonwealth free from control from outsiders. The populist movement of radical farmers, Knights of Labor, the vibrant labor movement were beginning to construct links that could have led to a very different America, a truly democratic, radical America based on a cooperative commonwealth of workers and farmers. Couldn't withstand state corporate repression and violence. It was crushed. Well, again, those were the authentic populists, not what's called populism today. The independent farmers, core of the society, seeking a cooperative commonwealth. It's tempting to draw comparisons to many other developments today. The struggles in West Bengal to establish cooperative farming communities, even to the huge farmer strike in India just last year, and worldwide to the Peasant Association via Campesina, and especially to the landless workers movement in Brazil, an enormous farmers cooperative, hundreds of thousands of people, not just farms, but taking over unused land that's owned by absentee landlords, taking it over, resisting severe attacks by authorities and landlord-run private militias, but establishing themselves, going on to develop agribusiness, dairy production, other kinds of industries, all cooperatively run. The largest popular movement in the world, major cooperative movement in the world. Well, that's new forms of authentic populism. There are others like it elsewhere. What's called populism in common discourse today is something quite different. It's angry, popular reactions to the disasters of the last 40 neoliberal years, often attracted to neo-fascist parties and to demagogues of the Donald Trump variety. Well, going back to the US a century after I'm now getting into my own personal experiences, which goes back to the early 1930s. Just for background, my own extended family was first generation immigrants, working class, mostly unemployed, many politically radical. And a few years after the fall of the House of Labor in the 1920s, a few years later came the Great Depression. For me personally, in my early childhood memories, the labor movement revived, it expanded, it moved to large-scale industrial organization for the first time, militant activities like sit-down strikes, where the workers just occupied factories. That's a real threat to capital. a sit-down strike is just one step before saying, we don't need bosses. We can run this place by ourselves, get lost. Back to the slogan of the Knights of Labor. Those who work in the mills and run them. Well, at that point, business became really frightened. It stopped its efforts to block New Deal measures, recognized that some kind of accommodation should take place. Crucially, there was a sympathetic administration. There was a lively, often radical political environment under the impetus of the reviving labor movement. All of this laid the basis for the New Deal reforms that enormously improved American life, had repercussions in the development of post-war European social democracy. Well, that's the 1930s. The traditional business rulers, those who Adam Smith had called the masters of mankind, those who have economic power, they were appalled by all these developments. Their publications in the 1930s warned ominously of what they called the hazard facing industrialists from labor action backed by the newly realized political power of the masses. Incidentally, if this terminology sounds vaguely Marxist, it's because it is. The business world is deeply Marxist. They're committed to class struggle. They understand class struggle. They're committed to it constantly. It's harsh class struggle. It's Marxism with the values inverted. So you often find Marxist terminology in business publications, like concern about the political power of the masses. Well, business efforts to restore their domination, go back to the 20s, they were put on hold during the Second World War. As soon as the war ended, the business world launched a major assault on labor. It was quite impressive in scale. It ranged from forced indoctrination sessions for the workforce, all the way over to things like taking over sports leagues and church groups. Nothing was left out. Most of this is suppressed in scholarship. It's not the kind of thing that people want you to know, but there is serious work on a very important development. Well, violent repression was no longer adequate to restoring the glory days of the 1920s. Too much freedom had been won. So therefore, more subtle means of indoctrination were devised, including what's called scientific methods of strike breaking. By now, that's been honed to a high art with the support of administrations since Reagan that barely pay attention to what remains of labor laws. This business campaign was expedited by a major attack on civil liberties. It's called McCarthyism, but he was only one part of it. That led to the expulsion of many of the most effective labor activists and organizers accused of communism. The unions entered into a compact with capital, class collaboration. Through this, they were able to gain benefits for their own members, not for the society, in return for abandoning any significant role on the shop floor. That was essentially the compact. Well, the early post-war years are a period called regimented capitalism. New Deal measures stayed mostly intact despite the business offensive. Banks were banks, a place where you had a little excess money, you put it into a bank. They could lend it to somebody who wanted to buy a car or send their kids to college. No financial crises. The banks were under tight control by the Treasury Department. No crashes. There was very high taxes on the wealthy and the corporations. There was very little cheating. The Treasury Department kept tight control. It's called by economists the golden age of capitalism. Very high growth, highest ever. And egalitarian, lowest quintile of the population was doing as well as the top quintile. By the 1960s, mid-1960s, popular activism was developing, was beginning to expose some of the long concealed record of American history. It was also beginning to address some of the brutal legacy of harsh, vicious American history. Again, by the mid-60s, with the cooperation of a sympathetic administration. Well, this is kind of reminiscent of the 30s. It again spread great fear among the business classes. Meanwhile, by the early 1970s, the established social order was beginning to totter. President Nixon had dismantled the post-war Bretton Woods system based on the dollar and the gold standard that undermined the international system. There was a period of stagflation, stagnation and growth and inflation. But most significantly, there was a growing threat of popular movements that were civilizing the society, addressing racial discrimination, developing, insisting upon women's rights, concern for the environment, and so on. Those are the popular movements of the 60s and their aftermath. All of that aroused elite concerns, much as in the 30s. The concerns are very well documented in major publications that bracket the mainstream spectrum of opinion. The most revealing are at the left liberal end of the mainstream spectrum. Most important is the first publication of the Trilateral Commission. Trilateral Commission is liberal internationalists of Europe, the United States, and Japan. The publication was called The Crisis of Democracy. The crisis that concerned them was the activism of the 1960s, which was mobilizing people to press their concerns in the political arena. It's what's called special interests. The special interests were imposing too many pressures on the state to meet their demands. That's what caused the crisis of democracy. The solution they recommended was, in their words, more moderation in democracy. In simple words, go home and shut up. The special interests were minorities, women, the young, the old, workers, farmers, in short, the population. They have a role. Their role is to be spectators, not participants in action. That's actually liberal democratic theory. There's a crucial premise which is unspoken. The special interests are to be put in their place so that ample room is left for the national interest. That's the masters of mankind. They shape national policy so that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to. I'm again quoting Adam Smith. His words resonate very loudly today. Of particular concern to the trilateral liberals were the failures of what they called institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, the schools and the universities. They're failing their responsibility of indoctrination. That's why you see young people protesting for civil rights, women's rights, ending a criminal war of aggression in Vietnam, other diversions from the proper course of passivity and conformism. So here too, a change of course is necessary for a proper social order to be sustained. These are tasks that were carried out in due course with sharp restrictions on educational institutions, defunding, indeed efforts under the Trump Republicans to destroy the public education system completely. That's a neoliberal ideal fostered by Milton Friedman, other neoliberal gurus. Defunding now has taken to such a level that teachers are just leaving. There's now a shortage of 300,000 teachers in the United States. Curricula are being controlled by right-wing legislatures. They're throwing books out of libraries, banning them in courses as a tax on school boards because they're not reactionary enough. People are just leaving. There's a ban on teaching history because it disturbs young people, particularly white people. They don't want to learn all this stuff. Real totalitarian effort developing right before our eyes. Well, going back to the Trilateral Report, it shows how popular activism was perceived at the left end of the mainstream spectrum. At the right end, positions were much harsher. Most important example is what's known as the Powell Memorandum, very significant publication submitted to the Chamber of Commerce, the main business association, written by a corporate lawyer, Lewis Powell, later appointed to the Supreme Court, called for strong measures by the state and private power to restore the rule of the masters. He outlined them very, very harsh. Well, the disarray of the 1970s provided the opportunity for the neoliberal intellectuals to take over. They could, in the 70s, they had taken over the economy of Chile under the neo-fascist Pinochet regime. Had perfect and total control. They succeeded in destroying it, the economy, within a few years. But they didn't care much because now they could take their doctrines to the United States and Britain and much of the world. And that's the beginning of the neoliberal assault. Neoliberal has some technical definitions, but the real meaning of the term is savage class war. That's neoliberalism. And it was understood. It didn't take long for it to be understood. By 1978, just as all of this was building up, the president of the United Auto Workers, main American Union, Doug Fraser, he withdrew from a commission, labor management commission organized by President Carter. He withdrew from it, issued a strong statement. I'll quote from it. He condemned business leaders for having chosen, I'm now quoting, chosen to wage a one-sided class war in this country, a war against working people, the unemployed, the poor, the minorities, the very young, the very old, even many in the middle class of our society. They broke and discarded the fragile, unwritten compact previously existing during a period of growth and progress. That was the golden age of fragile class collaboration. It's 1978. Then we move on to the full-fledged class war of the neoliberal years, beginning with Reagan and Thatcher in England. Well, meanwhile, the political parties adapted to this business assault, helped accelerate it. The Democrats abandoned their commitment to working people, became a party of affluent professionals and Wall Street, kind of people who show up at former President Obama's lavish parties. There had been moderate Republicans, pretty much the same as liberal Democrats. They disappeared completely. The Republican Party leadership understood very well that they cannot gain votes on their actual policies of abject service to the super rich and the corporate sector. Can't get votes that way. So they had to shift voters' attention to something else, to what are called cultural issues. That process began with Richard Nixon, what was called his Southern strategy. The Democrats had been supporting civil rights legislation, so the Southern strategy was designed to switch Southern Democrats to Republicans by racist dog whistles, as they're called. You don't come out right and say, I'm a racist, but you intimate it in other ways. Under Reagan, these dog whistles just became open shouts. Reagan himself was an open racist, didn't try to hide it. They also recognized the Republicans in the 70s that by pretending, I stress, pretending to oppose abortion, they could pick up the evangelical and Catholic vote. Then came guns and all the rest of the current apparatus of deception. Meanwhile, behind the curtain, the party pursued the vile maxim of Adam Smith, all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else, pursued it with a vengeance. Well, while the Democrats had delivered working people to their class enemy, still there were barriers to the assault, the labor movement. The Reaganites understood the need.
Yes, Professor Chomsky has muted himself by mistake.
Renewed. I don't know how much was lost off the back of sentence. The Reaganites launched a major war against labor and with Thatcher in England at the same time. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Yes, okay. So they launched a major attack on labor.
Yes, sir.
That was the opening of neoliberalism in the United States and Britain.
Yes, we can hear
opened
you.
the door.
We can
Can't
hear
hear
you.
me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I don't know what the problem is.
Professor, we
now?
all can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Sir, we can hear you, but there are some background noises from our other participants who are trying to fix
So
it.
that opened the door to the corporate world. Opened the door to the corporate world to carry out its own major assault on labor, supported by the political parties, the administrations, which just refused to apply labor law. Clinton came along 1990s. He cooperated with his policies of neoliberal globalization. These were designed to maximize corporate profit, undermine labor still further. Well, I'm not going to take the time to review the consequences, just a few examples to illustrate what's happening in the most powerful, most country in the world with the most advantages. There are studies of the transfer of wealth from the poor, the working class, the middle class, to the top 1% of the population. It amounts to about $50 trillion. Class war. $50 trillion transferred from working people, middle class, the poor, lower 90% of the population, transferred to the top 1%. That's very successful class war, very much like the 1920s. Same happened in Britain. Vast increase since Thatcher in multi-billionaires, huge explosion of food banks where people go to maybe find a little food that can take them through the day, to parallel developments. Another revealing illustration of the neoliberal class war is mortality. From one of the major recent studies, scientific studies. From the 1980s, the US started falling behind its peers in mortality, reaching over 1 million extra deaths by 2021. 1 million people died as compared with other advanced countries. Again, these are working people, of course. That's effective class war. In the last half dozen years, mortality in the United States has in fact increased, something that never happens outside of war and large-scale pestilence. Economists call this deaths of despair, almost entirely white working class. People have just given up, take drugs, kill themselves. Huge increase, unprecedented, doesn't happen anywhere. It's also since 1980s that US healthcare costs began to diverge radically from comparable countries, bringing also some of the worst outcomes. The 1970s was about the same. Since then, if you look at the graphs, US skyrockets, in other countries, not much. Well, there are other dimensions that reveal similar departures from the norm. So take incarceration. Incarceration as a sign of social breakdown. In the 1970s, US incarceration rates were about the same as comparable countries. By now, they're about 5 to 10 times as high. During these years, the Republicans pretty much abandoned any pretense of being a normal parliamentary party, to the extent that arouses some amazement among longtime political analysts. Two of the major ones describe the Republican Party as a radical insurgency that's abandoned normal parliamentary procedures. Some go even further. One of them is the veteran political analyst of the London Financial Times, Edward Luce. He writes, I'm quoting him, "I've covered extremism and violent ideologies around the world over my career. I have never come across a political force more nihilistic, dangerous, and contemptible than today's Republicans, nothing close. His comment is endorsed by former CIA Director Michael Hayden. Well, this policy accelerated under the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, who was very explicit. He said, we must block anything that Democrats try to achieve because we must do everything to take power, no matter how much it harms the population. You can see that in the current Congress. Republicans vote 100%, no deviation, 100% against anything, any proposal that might help the population. By now, qualifications for Congress among Republicans are pretty much reduced to voting no, and occasional trips to Mar-a-Lago to shine Trump's shoes. The popular base has been affected by this, particularly in the years of Trump worship, and it is worship. That's no exaggeration. It's treated as God. The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, literally said that Trump was sent to the earth by God to Israel against Iran. That's the Secretary of State. Among voters, many believe the same. 70% of Republicans believe that the 2020 election was stolen. There are, of course, demographic changes taking place in the United States. The preponderance of whites is declining. Now, 2/3 of Republicans believe that these demographic change being orchestrated by liberal leaders who are trying to replace the white race. It's called the Great Replacement. Long ago, that theory was restricted to a neo-Nazi fringe. Now it's 70% of Republicans. About half of Republicans think that Democrats are involved in child sex strategy, sex trafficking rings. Almost an unbelievable story goes on in the most remarkable ways. Actually, the most ominous is the very marginal concern with global warming. There was a recent major study which asked people, gave them 29 options of issues, important issues, and asked them to rank them in importance for their vote in the current November election. Well, among Republicans, what they called moderate Republicans ranked them 28th. The rest of the Republicans marked them 29th. It's only the most important issue in human history, but for the Republicans, barely mentionable. That's a reflection of obedient leadership denialism since 2009. Very revealing to see what happened. 2008 election, John McCain, a Republican candidate, they did have a mild, inadequate, but at least mild climate program, plank on their program. The huge Koch brothers energy conglomerate heard of this and immediately launched a huge campaign, a juggernaut, to end this bribery of congressmen, threats, a huge lobbying campaign, fake popular organizations. The party totally capitulated. Since then, the leadership is 100% Alice. There are a few who say maybe global warming's happening, but we don't care. That's a shocking cowardice, which may do us all in, all over the world, if they regain power in November. And they may gain permanent power. They're undertaking radical efforts to try to restrict voting so that they can remain a permanent minority party. The deeply reactionary Supreme Court is cooperating. You should take a careful look at what's happening.
How do you
Himself has said that
evaluate?
if he gains office again, well, his first act will be the name is Schedule F. It means changing civil service. Civil service is non-political. That's the foundation of any democratic society, is a nonpartisan civil service. Trump's announced he's going to change that. He's going to select party loyalists, his loyalists, to run the civil service, a major step towards fascism. First step. Supreme Court decided to take a totally exotic suit in its session. It's called the independent state legislature theory. Moore v. Harper, if you want to look it up. The theory, it resurrects a theory saying that state legislatures, which are mostly Republican, can pick their own electors, no matter what the vote is.
Evaluate.
I mean, this is so exotic. Nobody's ever thought of it before.
Evaluate.
It's just to reflect the popular vote. This says they don't have to. If the voters vote Democratic, they can pick Republican electors. It's astonishing that this is even being considered. The deeply reactionary court might very well pass it. Well, if you want to know what's in store, take a look at the recent meetings in Budapest, then in Dallas. These are meetings of the most reactionary forces in Europe, focused on Hungary. Viktor Orban is the star. He's the racist, Christian nationalist, proto-fascist government. That's hailed as the ideal for the future. The star performers at these Budapest and Dallas conferences were the Conservative Political Action Caucus, basically the core of the Republican Party, hailed speeches by Trump, by other leading Republicans, hailing this as the ideal of the future. This actually extends to the world. The major geopolitical project of the Trump administration was to construct an alliance of brutal reactionary states from Washington. The famous Abraham Accord was one part of it. Modi's India is a natural participant. That's likely to be consolidated. And worst of all, the world will careen to terminal disaster under Republican impetus while profits flood the fossil fuel companies and the banks that invest in them. Well, that's the plan for the future. Doesn't have to happen. Fortunately, significant changes are well within reach in what remains in the United States a very free society by comparative standards. But opportunities have to reach consciousness. They have to be grasped firmly. Can't overemphasize the fact that by now survival is at stake. Well, that's the United States, most powerful state in world history. What happens there is sure to have a major impact on the future of the world. How much of an impact depends on what others will do. Europe may decide that hanging on to Washington's coattails is too costly. They would do well to increase their engagement with a huge China-based system being established in Asia, spreading beyond might lead to the kind of multipolar international system most of the world advocates, India in particular. The future is uncertain, but one thing is clear, crystal clear. Conflict and competition must give way to cooperation. We'll either work together or we'll fall off the cliff together. So simple as that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky, for your insightful and very deeply engaging lecture. This is Nirupam Hazra from Interface. Now, with your permission, sir, I would like to take a few questions from the participants. If you allow, then I can read out some of the questions that are there in our chat box. So I'll read out some of the questions or observations that are there in the chat box. Yeah, one question is from...
Shall I start looking at these?
Sorry, sir?
Okay.
So can we have for a while some of the questions from our participants?
Shall I start with the one from Kaushik Ghosh?
Yes, Kaushik Ghosh.
It's observed that populism has emerged as one of the... Shall I begin with that? Can everybody see it?
Yes, sir, it is visible. Yeah.
Or shall I read it? I'll read it. It's observed that populism has emerged as one of the greatest threats to democracy in the 21st century. What has so profoundly changed that makes populism one of the biggest threats to democracy today? First, what is populism? There was an authentic populist movement, radical farmers. Many similar ones today, mentioned a few. That's authentic populism. There's something else that's called populism. This is angry responses to people who have been cast aside and repressed during the neoliberal class war. They're atomized, disorganized, labor unions, the natural mode of association has been destroyed, other associations destroyed, they're just cast out on the market to survive somehow. That's called populism. Has nothing like the traditional form. These are just people who are easily easy prey to demagogues. That's a threat. The demagogues lead them towards neo-fascist directions. You see it right in India with the Modi dismantling of democracy and installing a Hindu ethnocracy. Plenty of support for it. You can see it in polls. You see it in the Trump phenomenon in the United States, Orban in Hungary, other right-wing demagogues around the world. Well, that's naturally a threat. The world fortunately escaped from fascism not easily in the 1940s. We don't want to see it resurrected. It's the result, the direct result of the shattering of society by the neoliberal class war, reinstituting in the United States something very much like the 1920s with comparable effects elsewhere in the world. That's a threat. Next one. As you wrote about responsibility in intellectuals, a democratic spree, but in general, under the rule of authoritarian rulers, different intellectuals tend to please the populist, charismatic leaders, moral policing, judging people without any constitutional standards, blatantly support the corruption done by leaders as a panacea, how far people can contribute to secure their personal life from these intellectuals, as they're very much intruding into the personal and private spaces through social media, later cyber technologies. Well, the techniques are new, but the vocation goes back to the earliest history. Go back to classical Greece. Who had suicide by drinking the hemlock? Socrates, the man who was corrupting the youth of Athens by asking too many questions, by trying to get people to think for themselves. Take the biblical records, roughly the same time. There are people called prophets. That's a bad translation of an obscure Hebrew word. They were not prophets. They were what they called dissident intellectuals. They were condemning the crimes of the evil kings. They were trying to organize, develop support for widows and orphans, poor people, dangerous people. How were they treated? They were imprisoned. They were driven into the desert. The most evil figure in the Old Testament, King Ahab, condemned the prophet Elijah as a hater of Israel because he was condemning the acts of the evil king. That's dissident intellectuals in the Bible. You look through the rest of history, it's the same. Most intellectuals, the overwhelming majority, are what in later years were called false prophets. The people supporting power, later they're called false prophets, not at the time. The time they're honored. Goes all the way through history. The term intellectual was introduced in its modern sense in the late 19th century in France. At the time of the Dreyfus trial, there were intellectuals like Émile Zola who were condemning the crime of the state in sending an innocent man to an island where he would be imprisoned and die, Dreyfus. What happened to the Dreyfusards, as they were called, were bitterly condemned. The mainstream intellectuals of the Académie Française harshly condemned these writers and artists who dare to criticize our holy government and magnificent army and so on. Zola himself had to escape France to survive. That's the pattern. So what you're describing, what the questioner describes, is the way it always is. Large majority of intellectuals are worshipers, supporters and worshipers of power. Now they have new technologies, and that's right. But there's a fringe who don't accept, usually treated badly in one way or another, depends on the nature of the society. You're seeing it in India, where some of them are being subjected to imprisonment and torture for questioning the august majesty of the state and the court and so on. Nothing new. So what do you do about it? What people have always done: arise, object, protest, develop popular organizations, struggle for peace and justice. Nothing new. That goes on to the next question. India is currently under an authoritarian rule where the government is systematically going to the opposition leaders using various state agencies. Do you think this what do you think this augurs for the purpose of democracy? Well, pretty obvious. It's destroying democracy. That's the point. Modi's goal, quite explicit, is to destroy Indian secular democracy, to impose a Hindu ethnocracy. Everyone else is repressed. Dissidents are tossed into jail, tortured. Others are beaten down in one or another way. So that's what you want India to be, accept it. If you don't, struggle against it. Old as the hills, as I say, it goes back to the earliest days of recorded history. No special about it, just still plenty of room for work. Said that India is the largest democracy in the world, but in reality, in India before election, alcohol, meat of chicken, mutton, beef, and so on are distributed among common people. Even political leaders are given a chance to meet with sex workers. Is this real democracy? How can we overcome the situation? It's democracy in trouble in many ways all over the world. That's one of the reasons why the doomsday clock is now at 100 seconds to midnight. We'll probably move closer if democracy continues to be shattered in the ways that we see in India, the world's largest democracy, in the United States, the most powerful country, in Britain, the earliest modern democracy, other ways elsewhere, then we're doomed. But we don't have to be. I mean, I mentioned the transition from the 1920s to the 1930s. Can happen again, can happen in the same way. Things like that have happened through history. And take the American Constitution, 1780s. The Constitution was radically anti-democratic. The founding fathers strongly opposed democracy. In fact, the leading scholarly work on the Constitutional Convention is called The Framers' Coup, the coup that the framers carried out against democracy. Democracy is what the population wanted. The wealthy white slave owners meeting in Philadelphia was not what they wanted. So there was a coup against democracy. Didn't own things. Population continued to struggle. Many victories were won over the years. Many regressions. Keep on fighting. That's called class war. The masters are constantly fighting vicious class war. If the rest of the population just watches passively, they win. But it doesn't have to. A lot of freedom have been won over the years. We now have many opportunities that people didn't have in the past. So, for example, in the United States, as I mentioned, you can't use the earlier methods to destroy labor, just straight violence. The paramilitaries, Pinkertons as they were called, just violently crush strikes, kill workers. Can't do that anymore. It was still going on in my childhood. Can't go on now. You have to use more subtle means of class war, neoliberal means. Those who recognize what's happening have to continue to struggle to make sure that the class war is not one-sided. Maybe we can move on to reach that cooperative commonwealth that the authentic populists were striving for in the late 19th century, and many like them are doing today. It's up to us.
Professor Chomsky, I have one question. Professor Chomsky.
Sorry to interrupt you, dear participant.
Nirupam, there is one question I would like to ask. I think we will run out of time.
Nirupam,
better that if you write it down, because all the participants are writing it in the chat box.
That's
so
right.
if you write it down, it will be better.
I'll make it very short. So, Professor Chomsky,
So what would you like me to do?
Do you see any solution emerging, any two-state solution
So I think
Well, I'm willing to do whatever you suggest.
I think we have come to the very end of our event. Are there more questions there? I don't think so. So now I would like to request Dr. Kaushik Ghosh to take over and continue the session.
So Nirupam, if it's fine, can I chip in with one last question?
Thank you, Mr. Nirupam Hazra.
Gosh.
Sir,
Okay.
please
Take
accept
one last question.
pranam from us. Chomsky sir,
One last question.
please accept pranam.
Question, take the question.
Bankura University. I am Kaushik Ghosh.
Okay.
On behalf of the Interface, I would like to thank Professor Chomsky for his precious time. This is indeed a remarkable moment of our lives. We are more than fortunate and privileged to have Professor Chomsky with us. I would like to thank our chief patron, Professor Deb Narayan Bandyopadhyay, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Bankura University, for his relentless support and encouragement. We are also thankful to Professor Shubir Kumar Roy, Registrar and his office, and Professor Jayanto Kumar Saha, Dean and his office. I would like to thank all our faculty members, officers, non-teaching staff, and students of Bankura University. And last but not the least, we are thankful to our audience. Without you, this event would remain incomplete. Now, I formally close this session with a hopeful anticipation of another such remarkable event in near future. Good night, everyone from India, and good afternoon. Have a nice day, Professor Chomsky. The Google form link will work till 30 minutes.
Thank you very